Good evening, everyone. How are y'all tonight? All right, good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening. Dr. Abigail Favale is a writer and professor at the University of Notre Dame and the McGrath Institute for Church Life. Her work lies at the intersection of Catholic theology, literature, and women's studies. Her abiding interest as a writer and scholar is the meaning and dignity of woman, and her work explores sexual difference and embodiment in the Catholic imagination. Dr. Favale also teaches in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame, where she covers topics such as Edith Stein's theology of woman and religion and literature. And I think she had said at dinner tonight, religion and literature was one of her favorite classes to teach, so you can ask her about the kinds of things she likes to teach about. Dr. Favale holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from George Fox University, as well as a master's degree in women, writing, and gender, and a PhD in English literature from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Her first book, Irregular Incarnation and Contemporary Women's Fiction, was awarded the 2014 Feminist and Women's Studies Association Book Award. Her second book, Into the Deep and Unlikely Catholic Conversion, is a spiritual memoir that traces her journey from birthright evangelicalism to postmodern feminism, and finally, to the Catholic Church. Her most recent book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, was published in 2022 and has already been translated into multiple languages. Her numerous essays have appeared in The Atlantic, First Things, Public Discourse, and many other publications as well. Dr. Favale is also a fiction writer, and she was awarded the J.F. Powers Prize for short fiction in 2017. So you can see she is a woman of many talents. She and her husband have 4 children and another on the way. They have, I think she described it as one very, very old cat and one very, very big dog. Was that the correct discussion there? Yes, she's like, yes, that's the correct discussion. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Favale for what's going to be a fascinating talk this evening.
Yes, the almighty clicker. Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to pull out my cheat sheet here. Well, thank you all so much for being here, for braving the cold to come sit and have me talk at you for a little while. I've really loved my visit here so far. This seems like a very special place, and everyone's been so warm and welcoming, so I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here. The mic is protesting. Okay. So one of the main challenges of talking about gender in our current context is that there are multiple and often contradictory definitions on offer. Is gender a synonym for sex? Is gender a social construct? Is gender an innate sense of self? So people are using this one word, the same term, but with wildly different meanings. And so we're often just talking past each other when we try to get into this conversation. So in this brief talk, I hope to do 2 things. First, I want to provide an orientation to the confusing and conflicted gender landscape by introducing you to the 2 dominant theories about gender in our contemporary moment. Secondly, I hope to illuminate how a Christian view compares with these 2 theories, namely an understanding of sexual difference as both a natural and sacramental reality. So let's begin by looking at the social constructionist understanding of gender, which is a theory that emerged in the 20th century and was, until recently, the predominant view in the world of secular gender studies. I often start this theory's genealogy with feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, and that may seem strange, considering that in her famous work on this topic, The Second Sex, she doesn't actually use the term gender. But she introduces in that book the concept that gender would soon come to name. And that concept is captured in her most famous line from that book: "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." That statement is the mustard seed of constructionist gender theory. So when de Beauvoir writes that one is not born, but becomes a woman, She's driving a wedge between the idea of woman and female, arguing that woman is a social and cultural fabrication that is projected onto the biological reality of femaleness. Second-wave feminists in the 60s and 70s, in particular, latched on to this distinction that Simone de Beauvoir was making. And instead of relying just on sex to classify men and women, they imported the term gender in order to distinguish between sex as a basic biological reality and gender as a collection of socially constructed norms and ideals that are associated with each sex and then mistakenly read as natural. So this is the classic sex-gender split, the second-wave feminist understanding of sex and gender that I first encountered when I began feminist studies about 2 decades ago. So simply put, sex refers to biology, and gender refers to the social or cultural meanings attached to sex. So feminists saw the concept of gender as providing a site of resistance to essentialism, which in feminist studies is the claim that men and women are innately different, that we differ at the level of our nature. So one can understand why this distinction has its appeal. At times, differences between the sexes have been translated into rigid sex-specific roles, too often assuming a kind of implicit hierarchy between men over women. Culturally bound assumptions about women have at times been too easily seen as natural and inevitable rather than distortions of culture. So an easy example might be the once commonly held belief that women are less rational or intellectually capable than men, and therefore don't need to have access to things like higher education, right? So feminists saw this concept of gender as a helpful tool that would enable them to better articulate that difference, to get at that difference between what is more of a cultural norm and what actually is innate or natural. However, in the late 1980s, this neat sex-gender distinction began to unravel, thanks in large part to the work of Judith Butler, who's really the godmother of contemporary gender theory. So Butler ups the ante of social constructionism, asserting that not just gender, but biological sex itself is a construct, it's a social fabrication. She writes, female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman. So Butler, in her early work, is leaning into many of the ideas asserted by Simone de Beauvoir, but taking them to new extremes. Near the end of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir proclaims that nothing is natural. And for Butler, that statement is really a foundational premise for her thought. So this idea that humankind is characterized by two sexes that are biologically complementary is a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. So Butler's early philosophy can really be described as anti-realist. So truth and knowledge are kind of suspended in air quotes as ultimately unknowable or perhaps even non-existent. All that remains is power. So knowledge is not a matter of discerning or recognizing what is true, because truth itself is a construction of power. So gender theory in this mode is radically constructionist. It rejects the idea that the words sex and gender, or related terms like male, female, man, woman. Gender theory in this mode rejects the idea that those terms name something real. Instead, these concepts are seen as social constructs that create the illusion of something real. Now, once this distance between bodily sex and identity was enabled via the concept of gender in the mid-20th century, it did not take long, merely a few decades, for gender to shift meanings once again, becoming entirely disconnected from sex. This disconnection paved the way for an even more fragmented understanding of the human person to emerge, a theory that is centered on the subjective understanding of gender, often called gender identity. So what is this theory, and how does it compare to constructionist gender theory? All right, so have you guys encountered the gender unicorn before? It's a pretty common infograph, right? And I find it to be a very helpful distillation of this particular gender theory. So according to this theory, one's identity as a man or woman, or both or neither, is based on one's subjective self-perception. So in this image, it's illustrated by that thought bubble, right, with the rainbow in it. So this theory separates manness and womanness from biological sex, rooting sex identity primarily in self-perception, in one's subjective experience, rather than in the body. And in cases where there's kind of a felt incongruence between that experience and one's biological sex, this model affirms the subjective experience of gender over the fact of biological sex. Now, in order for this theory to seem plausible, in order for us to be convinced that to be female is fundamentally a feeling, we have to unlearn the intuitive truth that the human species has two sexes, male and female. And this unlearning is being facilitated in large part by the manipulation of language. So take the phrase sex assigned at birth, which has become pretty common HR terminology. The word assigned here is very weighty, it's very philosophically loaded, because it conveys the idea that biological sex is something that is imposed by a physician at birth, rather than a fact that is recognized and recorded. Now that phrase, assigned at birth, has an interesting history. It emerged and was first used, and once only used, in reference to complex congenital disorders of sexual development that sometimes result in apparent sexual ambiguity at birth. In these extremely rare cases, doctors would sometimes initially assign a sex because the maleness or femaleness of the baby was not readily apparent. But in the theory of gender subjectivism, that terminology, assigned at birth, is now used in reference to all births, as if every human being is born sexually ambiguous. And that opens the way for sex categories like male and female to be redirected from the structure of the body, the organization of the body, and toward that subjective sense of self. Now, some of you may be picking up on an interesting paradox or tension here. The idea that gender is purely a social construct, something that is imposed upon us by society, is markedly different from the idea that gender is a real, innate, immutable identity that one accesses through self-perception. In fact, I would argue that these are two contradictory ideas, and this slide illustrates the ways in which they contradict. So constructionism sees gender as extrinsic to the self. It's outside of us. It's rooted in society. It's also something artificial. It's kind of a construct. And it's oppressive, right? In gender constructionist theory, gender isn't really seen as something good. It's kind of an oppressive regime that we should actively try to resist and deconstruct. Gender subjectivism, in contrast, sees gender as something intrinsic. It's something real within the self. It's who you really are. And it's deeply authentic, and it's actually liberating to realize and express one's gender. So these are really two pretty fundamentally different understandings. Now, is there a way to kind of make them cohere, right? I'll try to steel man that for a second. I mean, you could say that we internalize social constructs, and they become, something like innate identities. But that's not what the proponents of gender subjectivism claim. Rather, they argue that gender identity is a truth so profound that you could realize it at a very young age, so very early in a socialization process. And in fact, that inner sense of self might actually be at odds with one's socialization as a girl or a boy. So according to gender subjectivism, the self-concept is what's real and immutable, but the body is malleable. It's the body that might be a lie. So I really do think these are fundamentally different theories of gender that are deeply in tension. So how did we get from one to the other, right? How did we go from constructivism to subjectivism when they seem so contradictory? Well, constructionism, as I mentioned earlier, is anti-essentialist. It's against essentialism. Whereas subjectivism arguably makes essentialist claims about gender, right? That we have this real innate essence, right, that we should kind of discern and then express. So I think what's happening, in part, is that there's a reification turn that is happening here. So to reify means to make real. So I think the kind of reign of radical social constructionist theory dethroned or deconstructed our understanding of the reality of sexual difference. And then this anti-realism cleared the way for a new kind of realism or a new essentialism to emerge, which is based not on the objective, intelligible world, but on the subjective world, on one's sense of self. So I think we're seeing two moves in this unfolding conceptual revolution. First, deconstruction, and then reification. So first, what is taken to be real, the immutability of sex, is dismantled through constructionist gender theory. And then in its place, a reconfigured understanding of reality is asserted. So I think that's in part how we get from gender as a social construct to gender is an innate sense of self, independent of socialization. Now, what's really interesting to me is that actually brings us to a bewildering reversal of the sex-gender split that I mentioned earlier from second-wave feminism, right, in which sex was the biological fact and gender the construct. Well, now it's flipped. Now in our kind of subjectivist moment, sex is the construct, but gender, that sense of self, is what's real. Now, another layer of confusion here, as if I haven't given us enough, is that there has not been a clean break between these two theories, right? Between gender as a social construct, gender is an innate sense of self. Instead, both definitions of gender are routinely offered in contemporary discourse, sometimes by the same person, sometimes even in the same sentence, right? Gender is a social construct. Gender is who you feel you are inside, right? So there's almost a constant equivocation about what exactly gender is. And a really good example of this is from the guidelines, the Associated Press guidelines. These are screenshots from those guidelines that direct journalists how to write about certain topics. And so here they offer certain definitions of terms. And so first they offer a definition of gender, which I'll just read the first part of it if I can. A social construct, okay, so we get social construct right away, right? So ding, constructionist. A social construct encompassing a person's behaviors, intrinsic identity, and appearance. Now, intrinsic means pre-social, it means innate, right? So already we have this tension between a kind of subjectivist understanding and then also a constructionist understanding in the same sentence. Okay, so it's kind of this valiant attempt to like shoehorn all the different meanings of gender into one definition. And then later in the same document, we get yet another definition in the term gender identity. So a person's sense of feeling, male, female, neither or more or combination of both. Often just gender will suffice. So here's yet another definition of gender, which is pretty straightforward, subjectivist understanding, right? So this is a really good example of kind of the equivocation of like, here is, gender is kind of like this three-headed hydra, with these different meanings sprouting out. And so that's where we are, in a cultural moment where both gender constructionism and gender subjectivism are on offer, but with the latter, with gender subjectivism, arguably now eclipsing the former. In fact, Judith Butler's latest book, in her latest book, she modifies and kind of tempers many of her constructionist claims in order to better accommodate gender subjectivism. So this shift is happening even in her own work. Now, I'm going to talk about what I think these theories have wrong, but I also think it's important to seek out truth wherever it can be found. And I think both constructionism and subjectivism offer us some half-truths. It is true that there are cultural expressions of sexual difference that are not strictly biological, but are rather constructs of culture. And these vary pretty widely across culture or across different historical time periods. Some of these cultural expressions are beautiful. Some are benign, and some are actively harmful. And being able to make a distinction between culture and nature is at times very helpful and very important. Similarly, subjectivism is getting at something true about human beings. We experienced our sexed identity differently than other animals. We are self-conscious, we are self-aware, we are rational, reflective, we are spiritual beings. So there is this rich subjective dimension to being a sexed human being. I can contemplate the meaning of my womanhood in a way that my very old cat never will, right? She doesn't have that capacity. There's a branch of Christian philosophy called personalism, in fact, that places great importance on this subjective dimension of being human. But there's also, so there's two half-truths, right? Two half-truths and a lie. So even Christian personalism does not overlook or deny the objective reality of our nature, which I would argue is what both of these theories do in their purest, most extreme forms. So they take what is an aspect of our personhood, that we are socially, culturally embedded beings, yes, and we do have this rich, subjective inner life, yes. Those are true, but they take this aspect of our personhood and make it absolute. So the shared lie or error on which they depend is this: the deconstruction of sexual difference, a rejection of the intrinsic meaning and dignity of the sexed body. And I would argue that it is this obfuscation of sexual difference, that is the major point of departure between a Christian understanding of gender and contemporary gender theories. The Christian understanding of gender is grounded in both reason and revelation. And in this view, in this way of seeing, gender is both a natural reality, something we can observe and understand through reason, through science, and it's also a sacramental reality. It carries sacred significance, which we can apprehend through the light of revelation. So first, let's talk about gender as a natural reality. The etymological root of the word gender is gens. It's a root you can also see in words like generation, or genealogy, or genesis. In the verb form, gen refers to begetting. In the noun form, it signifies offspring, or kin. The root meaning of gender, then, is connected to generativity, and it names the reality that there are two kinds of humans necessary for generation, the male and the female. So there's not then, in this view, a separation between sex and gender, and this is important. Separating gender, separating woman from female or man from male, undermines the fundamental unity of the human person. We are unions of body and soul. The union of spirit and matter forms a single nature. That's what a human being is. So our bodies are ourselves, right? We're not little Casper ghosts in meat suits, okay? But we're full unions of spirit and matter. Now, for our purposes today, because of that union, when I'm kind of speaking in the rest of the talk in a Christian mode, so I'll be using the terms gender and sex or sexual difference more or less interchangeably, right? Because I actually want to lean into that intuition that, yes, woman names the female human being and man names the male human being. So in order to talk about gender as a natural reality, we have to talk about sex. As I mentioned earlier, much of the confusion and equivocation about gender in our time depends upon obfuscating the reality of sex. Sex is often presented as some kind of ambiguous, scalar or spectral phenomenon that is so complex and mysterious that we simply can't make objective judgments about it, right? I'm not a biologist. I don't know what sex is. But friends, that's not true. Sex is quite simple to define and can, in almost all cases, be readily observed. So sex refers to the organization of the body according to a particular reproductive niche or generative potential. So the definitions that Aristotle gave us over 2,000 years ago still hold true. A woman is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate within herself. And a man is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate outside of himself. This definition still holds true, but we have to be prepared to respond to two common objections. The first objection: what about infertility? How can we define what it means to be a man or a woman according to a generative potential when some people are infertile? This is a very understandable objection, and one I would have once made myself. Not everyone is fertile, and in fact, no one is always fertile. But the answer to this objection depends upon the meaning of the word potential. So I'm using this term in a technical, philosophical way. By potential, I mean an inherent capacity that exists, whether or not it is ever actualized. So every woman has the potential to generate life within, and her entire physiology is organized according to that potential. Now, there are, of course, conditions that prevent that potential from resulting in actual generation. And these instances can be a profound source of pain, precisely because there is a telos, there is an order or purpose to the body that is being prevented, that is being thwarted. We do not say that a man is infertile because he's unable to get pregnant, because he doesn't have that innate potential, but a woman does. So in fact, the very category of infertility gestures back to the distinctive procreative capacities of each sex. What it means to be infertile is different for a woman and different for a man because the potentials are different. So rather than an argument for the opposition, the case of the infertile man or woman reaffirms the definition that I've proposed. So a second objection, what about intersex conditions? And this is by far the most common objection that I hear. Sex is not binary. Intersex people exist. Now, in these discussions, the term intersex is used in such a way to suggest that there's some people who are completely outside the categories of male and female, as if there's a kind of third sex, or perhaps a non-sexed category of persons who are neither male or female, or somehow both male and female. Used in this way, the intersex card, so to speak, can be played to justify the idea that the sex binary is a construct, thus opening the door for a subjective ground of gender. So let me briefly clarify what intersex conditions are and what they are not. The term intersex refers to a range of different conditions that somehow affect the sexual reproductive system. The technical term most often used by the medical establishment is disorders of sexual development, or DSDs. Now, these refer to objectively diagnosable physiological conditions. That's really important. So they refer to something that is atypical about the body. And they are best understood as variations within the categories of male and female, rather than exemptions from them. In fact, intersex is a canopy term. There's over a dozen discrete different disorders of sexual development that are kind of captured under that term. And many DSDs are in fact sex-specific, right? So only males get Klinefelter syndrome, for example. So it's really important to begin to think of the fact that there are intersex men and intersex women, right? That intersex isn't somehow this other, completely outside of the binary. How common are DSDs? Now, there's an oft-quoted stat out there that greatly exaggerates the prevalence of these conditions, claiming that 1.7% of people are intersex, as many as have red hair. Maybe you've heard this claim. Now, this statistic comes from the work of biologist Anne Fausto Sterling, whose work I studied in graduate school. And she is heavily influenced by constructionist gender theory. Now, she gets to this statistic, by defining as intersex any deviation from the, quote, Platonic ideal of male and female. So it's a very overly capacious definition that would include a huge range of conditions, such as, for example, women with polycystic ovarian syndrome who have higher levels of testosterone than are typical for women, but who are clearly, unambiguously women, right? So while the term intersex is used to imply sexual ambiguity, that's how the term is used. In reality, and this is important, this is probably the most important thing I'll say about intersex conditions, the vast majority of people with intersex conditions are unambiguously male or female. Only the most complex DSDs result in apparent sexual ambiguity at birth. And these are extremely rare, occurring in only 0.018% of live births. So to flip the stat, that means that 99.982% of the time, Sex is unambiguous and readily recognized at birth. That number actually surprises me, considering how complex the sexual development process is and how many opportunities there are for things to go awry. But this is a remarkable statistic that shows that sex is not in fact a spectrum or a construct, but a remarkably stable binary. So from the vantage point of both reason and science, we can understand gender as a natural reality, one that is bodily and is thus visible and grounded in our different capacities for generation. But that's not all we can say about gender, not in the Christian understanding. Gender is not merely a natural reality, but is also a sacramental one. And this, my friends, is why I love being a Christian. Because as a Christian, I get to absorb all that reason and science can tell me. I get to observe and explore the order and beauty and complexity of nature. But I also know that there is a higher order of beauty and complexity, of which nature is only a sign. However wonderful the natural world is, it is not absolute. It is not self-creating and self-sustaining. Its beauty and order carry a greater signifying meaning. Nature points beyond itself to the things of God. What I'm describing here in theological terms is the sacramental principle, which in its most basic form holds that the visible reveals the invisible. The visible world of nature reveals and mediates the hidden realities of God. Material realities are windows into the divine. And this is no less true. In fact, I would argue that it is more true of our bodies, of gender itself. The world, and especially our bodies, are sacred signs, icons that reveal the reality of a loving God, a God who is seeking to make himself known. So what then is the sacred meaning of sexual difference? What does it reveal? Clearly, it holds profound temporal significance as the sole means by which human beings come into existence. But this earthly meaning points to a deeper, higher spiritual meaning. Sexual difference serves a sacramental purpose. It is an integral part of how we image God. In his series of homilies known as the Theology of the Body, Catholic philosopher and Saint John Paul II writes that the human being appears in the visible world as the highest expression of the divine gift. And he's using man here in a generic sense, meaning the human person, male and female. According to John Paul II, the very sacramentality of creation, the sacramentality of the world, is revealed in the human person, created in the image of God. He writes that it is through our bodiliness, our masculinity and femininity, that the human person becomes a visible sign of the economy of truth and love, which has its source in God himself. Gender, then, is a visible sign of the relationship between God and humankind, which is a gift that springs from the union of truth and love. John Paul II draws deeply here from the Genesis creation accounts, which depict a dynamic between God and creation that is characterized by gift. It's a dynamic that carries through the Old and the New Covenants, culminating in the Incarnation and Christ's sacrifice of love, his self-gift on the cross. God is the ultimate giver, the generous source of being, and our ultimate calling is to say yes to his gift. This dynamic of gift is etched into our very nature as men and women. As JP2 puts it, sexual difference is the original sign of a creative donation, of a creative giving. There is a strong link between the mystery of creation as a gift that springs forth from love and man's existence as male and female. Let me try and paraphrase what he's saying here. My female body visibly signals the capacity for motherhood. Again, whether or not that is ever actually realized. Yet that capacity on its own is dormant. It can only be actualized by male generativity and vice versa. Our distinctive generative powers, then, in order to become fruitful, require the generosity of the other and our own receptivity. So we receive the generative potential of the other even as we give of our own generativity. So thus man and woman with our co-generative powers have the unique capacity to form an interpersonal communion that has the potential to bring forth new life. This is a reflection, a distant image of the divine. The Christian understanding of God as Trinity is that God is a communion of divine persons, and the Godhead is the source of all being and all life. And through our sexual difference, we image the ineffable Trinity, this ineffable mystery, in a profound way. Sexual difference is a sign that we are made for communion, that we are made in the image of God, who is in himself a communion of persons. This is how the Catechism of my own tradition puts it. God is love, and in himself he lives a mystery of personal, loving communion. God inscribed in the humanity of man and woman the vocation and thus the capacity and responsibility of love and communion. This generative meaning of the body is an aspect of the body's nuptial meaning. Generation, after all, is brought about by a bodily union between two persons, and not just any two will do. This kind of whole-person generative union is only possible through sexual difference, maleness and femaleness, through a bodily difference that is oriented toward or ordered toward the other. Gender is thus also a sign of the nuptial character of divine human communion. All throughout Scripture, God's relationship with humankind is depicted as nuptial, initially in the covenant with Israel and then culminating in the union of Christ and the church. This is yet another way that sexual difference carries a higher iconic meaning. These are not mere symbols, empty and arbitrary, but on the contrary reveal something profound about ultimate reality, about our true destiny, union with God, union that in Scripture is described as a marriage, a union of bridegroom and bride. In a sacramental Christian understanding, then, gender is part of God's self-revelation, his self-disclosure through the visible world. He speaks to us in a kind of image language, in visible signs and symbols, including the signs of our bodies. Both of the secular theories of gender I discussed distort this sacramental perspective. Gender subjectivism defines gender as subjective and thus an invisible reality. And this disrupts the sacramental dynamic where the visible reveals the invisible, and thus erases the body's sacramental meaning. And if gender is only a construct, well, it tells us nothing about the things of God. It is merely a human projection, a funhouse mirror of our own fantasies that reveal nothing of the divine. But the truth, my friends, is so much better. We are living icons. You, yes, you, are a living icon, all of you. My beloved sister who hates looking at herself in the mirror, you are a living icon. My beloved brother who feels intense distress about being male, you are a living icon. My brothers and sisters who are ravaged by disease or age or injury, you still, in your very being, reveal the things of God. This is the truth about gender, the beautiful truth that our faith gives us, a truth that we must cultivate in our hearts and also carry into the world with boldness and delight. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. So if you'll catch my attention, I'll come to you as quickly as I can, and we'll try to get a few of them in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Who's first?
So as you're talking about the paradox between the social construct and like you, of course, articulated that. Is there anybody like in the like more secular mindset that will talk about that, like, and also articulate that? Because I feel like a lot of times it's like polarized, or they kind of have a mix of those things when you just talk with other people about that. But I've never really known anybody else to have like a framework to put that into.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not really seen it directly discussed, and it's interesting. When I was beginning to kind of think through how to formulate this, it just became something I noticed, right? I just started to notice that part of it was because in my own education in gender theory and feminist theory, it was resolutely constructionist. And so I started to notice when all of a sudden there seemed to be this kind of new framework emerging, especially in the classroom, right, where students would kind of come in with this understanding of gender, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. It doesn't sound like the theories that I learned. It also doesn't sound like, there's the kind of typical, maybe Christian view. And so I began to be curious about it. And so I remember once in my office, I just kind of picked off some of the gender textbooks I had, gender theory textbooks, secular gender theory textbooks. And I started looking through, like, okay, where do they define gender? Okay, da-da-da-da. And there, I remember one particular textbook, it was pretty much constructionist. But then there was just one section, in talking about trans identities where it went subjectivist. But there was no kind of acknowledgement that there was a tension, right? So I found that to be interesting. And so what I most often see is just the kind of moving from one to the other. The same is true in Judith Butler's most recent book. So it's a tension that is there but not really named or explored, at least in what I have encountered so far.
Further question?
Yeah, so I don't want to make this too long. I was trying to gather my thoughts, but I just read The End of Woman by Dr. Carrie Gress. Anyway. So I thought it was really good. It was more historical and obviously about feminism. But I think sort of through that, and actually Theology of the Body is my next read, so that'll be good. And but through feminism, I think sort of the woman has kind of lost her identity as a general. So basically, coming back to more the telos of sort of each gender, right? Specifically, maybe how then should woman live specifically, right? Or how then should man live with regards to perhaps the body and the spirit as two separate teloses, or similar, or because obviously the body has a specific end in mind. But yeah, I hope that was clear.
Yeah, okay. Wait, so what's the question? Like, just, I feel like there was a lot of things I could respond to in there.
Yeah, so basically, there's just kind of an ambiguity, I guess, into what each, obviously, male and female have different ways they should live because they're different. So, what is the end of woman,
seriously.
icon of man?
I don't know that I would say that men and women have different ways that they should live because they're different, right? So when we talk about gender, we have to kind of keep three levels in tension. And I've been talking a lot about one of those levels, which is the level of sexual difference. But there's also the level of human. So men and women are also both fully human beings. And so what we define as human flourishing is true of both men and women. And the full range of, say, human capacities for virtue are open to both sexes. So there's an enormous amount that we share, right? And certainly in the realm of grace, the realm of salvation, we have the same call there to union with God, to self-gift, to holiness, right? But then there is the level of sexual difference where there is meaningful difference between the sexes. Because we are our bodies, right? We are different bodies in the world. We have different experiences because of that. And so it's important to be able to talk about that and to maybe also sometimes try to describe how that difference manifests in terms of averages, right? But then there's also the level of the individual. So there's also an incredible amount of variation and variety among women and among men that's also part of God's creative design, right? I mean, sometimes I think about the fact that of all the billions of women who've ever existed, not a single two of them are alike, right? So we also, in our kind of understanding of gender, have to make room for the kind of individual manifestation of maleness or femaleness that may not fall into the kind of typical variation, right? So I think I feel like theories of gender tend to fall in two extremes. One, by losing sight of all three of the levels together, right? So on the one hand, you have theories that perhaps downplay the difference, the level of difference, and really emphasize our shared humanity to where basically we're interchangeable and we should kind of neutralize our language and just talk about parents and not use the word mother and father, things like that, right? That's just kind of an extreme version. Or they really emphasize the level of the individual, or basically, there are as many genders as there are people, right? And then on the other hand, you have theories of gender that I think you see a lot in the Christian circles that really lean into the difference, but then at the expense of a sense of shared humanity between men and women, right? Where we kind of like divvy up human traits and capacities into this like pink list and blue list, right? But that forecloses each sex from full human flourishing, right? Or by denying kind of individual difference or even seeing the atypical man or the atypical woman as somehow a problem, right? And so I think it's really important when we talk about gender to avoid those extremes, to hold on to both meaningful difference, but also common humanity and individual uniqueness. I don't know if that actually answered your question, but that's where I went.
A couple more questions.
I will say while he's walking the mic, that when we talk about ideal masculinity and ideal femininity, the way I understand that is male and female holiness. So true femininity is holiness manifest in a female person, and true masculinity is holiness manifest in a male person. So again, I see this as really like iconic difference, right? Like think about, this is kind of a Catholic example, but hopefully it'll help. I think about an image or an icon of Joseph holding the Christ child, right? And think about an image or an icon of Mary holding the Christ child. Now, if you were to abstract those two images into traits, the list would look the same, like tenderness, mercy, affection, whatever. But they're different. They're different because of the body that's manifesting those virtues, right? And so I really think that's, that we should understand sexual difference primarily as an embodied, iconic reality and not be super quick to then want to abstract that into a list of kind of disembodied traits that we divvy up between men and women. Yeah. So going back to the telos ideas, then I really think it is holiness. Like that's the telos, is holiness in communion with God. But the way we live that out is going to be a little different. It's going to be embodied differently. Okay. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I think you just sort of answered my question, but I'm your biggest fan, by the way, I read this book,
Cool.
And my reflection paper was 8,000 words long.
Amazing.
When you mentioned that material realities are a window to the divine, and you mentioned icons, the first connection I made was for Catholic identity, and the concept of transubstantiation came to mind. Is there a denominational influence that enables a better understanding of the holistic notion of the human condition in the context of sex and gender? And are Protestants, do they have, as a Protestant myself, do we have a proclivity towards bifurcating the abstract and tangible, and therefore being predisposed to to a Gnostic view of the corporal body, which seems to echo the sentiment of gender dysphoria.
I feel like you're going to get me in trouble.
Time, folks. Thank you.
Look. I mean, obviously I'm speaking as a Catholic, right? And Catholic theology is very sacramental. But I think Christianity is very sacramental and very incarnational, right? So when I talk about these truths, that's why I say it's a Christian theory, not a Catholic theory per se. Because if you look at all the central Christian mysteries of the faith, the body matters in all of them. You know, especially you think about the incarnation, right? You think about even the ascension, like we always forget the ascension, right? But like after Jesus died and was resurrected, it wasn't like he like threw off his body, like don't eat that old thing anymore, Like no, he ascended bodily into heaven, right? So the incarnation is an eternal reality. But then the resurrection, okay? So in the temporary separation of the body and soul, which is death, the dissolution of our nature, that's not the goal, that's the problem that Christ came to solve, right? And we get our bodies back, okay? So Christianity is a very incarnational religion that takes the body seriously. Now, Christians of all stripes, whether Protestant or Catholic, have not always lived up to this well. There have been periods or different variations of Christianity or periods in Christian history where the body has been denigrated or scapegoated. There's a big kind of overly Platonic influence in early Christian thought that at times denigrates the body. So it's taken a while for the kind of the seeds of the incarnational seeds in Christian revelation to really kind of fully develop and flourish. And I also think that Protestant thought, you guys kind of ditched the sacramentality there for a little bit, but you can get it back, right? Before I worked at Notre Dame, I worked at a Quaker school. And when I would talk about sacramentality, the Quakers were like, oh yeah, totally. Like, we see all of reality as sacramental, right? So sacramentality, I think, is very much a kind of Christian notion that even if it has been downplayed in certain Protestant denominations, I think there's very much a sense in which it's our kind of legacy and part of our heritage as Christians and embedded in our theology. So I would say that. Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.